The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Highgrove House as Charles sat alone in his study. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking another lonely evening since Diana's passing. 5 years had gone by, yet the pain still felt fresh. Like an open wound that refused to heal, he had been going through Diana's personal belongings that day, something he had avoided for years. The task felt too overwhelming, too final. But now, with William and Harry asking about their mother's things, Charles knew he could no longer postpone it. The attic was dusty and filled with memories. Boxes upon boxes of Diana's life sat waiting to be sorted. Her clothes still carried the faint scent of her favorite perfume. Her jewelry sparkled even in the dim light filtering through the small window. Each item told a story of the woman he had once loved, the woman who had given him 2 beautiful sons. Charles had been methodically going through each box. When his fingers brushed against something unexpected, hidden beneath a collection of letters from various charities was a small leather-bound book. The cover was worn and soft to the touch, clearly handled many times over the years. There was no title on the front, just Diana's initials embossed. In gold lettering that had faded with time, his heart began to race as he realized what he was holding. Diana's personal diary? He had never known she kept one. Throughout their marriage, she had been private about her thoughts and feelings, often retreating into herself when things became difficult between them. This small book might hold the answers to questions that had haunted him for years. Charles hesitated, the diary heavy in his hands. Did he have the right to read her most private thoughts? Diana was gone, unable to give her permission. But then again, perhaps understanding her better might help him heal. Might help him be a better father to their sons who still struggled with the loss of their mother. The rain continued, its steady rhythm against the windows as Charles made his decision. He carefully opened the diary to the first page. Diana's handwriting was immediately recognizable, flowing and elegant, just like everything else about her. The first entry was dated just a month after their wedding. "Today I tried to be the perfect princess," she had written. "I smiled at all the right moments, said all the right things, wore the dress everyone expected me to wear. But inside, I felt so lost. This palace feels like a beautiful prison, and I wonder if I'll ever truly belong here." Charles felt a pang of guilt as he read those words. He remembered that day, a state dinner where Diana had indeed seemed radiant to everyone else. But he had been too caught up in his own duties to notice her inner struggle. He turned the page and continued reading. Entry after entry revealed a side of Diana he had never fully understood. She wrote about feeling lonely in their vast homes, about struggling to understand the complex rules and protocols of royal life. She described watching him from across crowded rooms, wishing she could reach him but not knowing how. "Charles seems so distant lately," one entry read. "I know he's under tremendous pressure, but I wish he would talk to me. I try to be supportive, but sometimes I feel like I'm speaking a different language. Maybe if I were smarter, more sophisticated, I could be the wife he needs." Tears began to blur Charles's vision as he read these words. How had he missed her pain? How had he been so blind to the woman who was reaching out to him? He remembered those early days of their marriage, how he had indeed felt the weight of royal expectations, how he had retreated into his work and duties. But he had never realized the effect his distance was having on Diana. The diary entries continued, painting a picture of a young woman trying desperately to find her place in a world she never asked to enter. Diana wrote about her love for William. When he was born, how holding her baby son made her feel complete for the first time since entering the royal family. She described sleepless nights walking the palace corridors with a crying William, finding solace in being needed by someone who loved her unconditionally. "William smiled at me today," she had written when their first son was just a few months old. A real smile, not just gas like the nurses said. "In that moment, I felt like I finally understood my purpose. I may not be the perfect princess, but I can be the perfect mother." Charles remembered those nights when Diana would insist on caring for William herself, despite the nannies being available. At the time, He had thought she was being stubborn, refusing help when it was offered. Now he understood that those moments with their son were lifelines for her. It's the only time she felt truly herself in the strange new world she had married into. As he continued reading, Charles began to see patterns in Diana's writing. She wrote often about wanting to make a difference, about feeling frustrated that her charitable interests were sometimes seen as less important than traditional royal duties. She had ideas, dreams of using her position to help people who were suffering, but she felt constrained by protocol and expectations. I met with the AIDS patients again today, one entry read. The way people look at me when I touch them, like I'm doing something revolutionary just by being human. Why should showing compassion be considered brave? These people are suffering and they need to know someone cares. I wish Charles could see what I see in these moments. Charles set the diary down for a moment, overwhelmed by the realization of how much he had misunderstood his late wife. He had often been critical of Diana's approach to royal duties, thinking she was too emotional, too willing to break protocol. Now he saw that her actions came from a deep well of empathy and a genuine desire to help others. The clock struck midnight, but Charles couldn't stop reading. Each page revealed more about the woman he thought he had known, showing him a depth of character and feeling that he had somehow missed during their years together. Diana's words were creating a new picture of their marriage, one that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. He realized that tomorrow would bring more revelations, more insights into the mind and heart of the mother of his children. Already, something fundamental was shifting inside him. The guilt he had carried for years was transforming into something else. A deeper understanding that would change everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the woman who had shared his life. Charles had barely slept that night. Diana's words echoed in his mind, painting vivid pictures of moments he thought he remembered clearly, but now realized he had completely misunderstood. As dawn broke over Highgrove, he returned to the diary. With a cup of tea, his hands trembling slightly as he turned to where he had left off, the entries he read next covered the period. When Harry was born, Diana's joy leaped off the pages as she described holding her second son for the first time. But mixed with that happiness was a growing sense of isolation that made Charles's chest tighten with regret. Harry has Charles's nose, she had written. I pointed it out to Charles when he visited the hospital, hoping to see him smile, to share this moment with him. But he seemed distracted, already thinking about the next meeting, the next obligation. Sometimes I wonder if he sees Harry and William as just another royal duty, rather than the miracles they are. Charles closed his eyes, remembering that day at the hospital. He had been proud, of course, but Diana was right. His mind had been elsewhere, focused on the constitutional implications of having a second heir, the arrangements that needed to be made. He had missed the simple joy of the moment, the wonder in Diana's eyes as she held their son. The diary entries revealed how Diana had tried to bridge the growing gap between them. She wrote about planning special dinners, trying to create moments where they could connect as a family rather than just as representatives of the crown. She described watching other couples laugh together, wondering why she and Charles seemed to speak past each other, even when they were in the same room. I organized a picnic today for just the four of us, one entry read. No staff, no photographers, just Charles, me, and the boys. I thought maybe if we could just be a normal family for a few hours, we might remember why we fell in love. Charles brought his briefcase. Even when Harry tried to show him a butterfly he'd caught, Charles was reading correspondence. I pretended to smile for the boys, but inside I felt like crying. Charles remembered that picnic. He had thought he was being responsible, using the quiet time to catch up on urgent matters. He had no idea that Diana had planned it as a way to reconnect their family. The butterfly incident came flooding back to him now. Harry, probably 3 years old at the time, had run up to him with cupped hands, eyes bright with excitement. Charles had absently patted his son's head while continuing to read, missing entirely the gift Harry was trying to share as he continued reading. Charles discovered that Diana had been keeping track of his interests, trying to understand the things that mattered to him. She wrote about reading books on architecture after learning about his passion for traditional building methods. She had attended lectures on organic farming because she knew how much Highgrove meant to him. She had even started learning about polo, hoping to find common ground with him through the sport he loved. "I went to Charles's polo match today," she had written. "I studied the rules beforehand so I could ask intelligent questions. When his team won, I was genuinely excited for him. But when I tried to congratulate him afterward, he seemed surprised that I was there. Sometimes I feel invisible in my own marriage." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. Remember Diana at his polo matches, always beautifully dressed, always smiling for the cameras. But he had assumed she was there out of duty, not genuine interest. He had never thought to explain the finer points of the game to her, or to share his enthusiasm for the sport that brought him such joy. Turning more pages, Charles found entries that showed Diana's growing confidence in her charitable work. She wrote passionately about the causes that moved her, describing visits to hospitals, homeless shelters, and schools in underserved communities. Her writing came alive when she described the people she met, the stories they shared with her. "I held a baby today at the children's hospital," she had written. "She was so small, fighting so hard to live. Her mother looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in weeks. I sat with them for an hour, just talking. When I got up to leave, the mother took my hand and said I had given her hope. I didn't do anything special, just listened. But somehow that was enough." Charles found himself smiling through his tears as he read these passages. This was the Diana the world had fallen in love with, the woman who could make anyone feel seen and valued. But what struck him most was how little he had encouraged this side of her. In fact, he realized with growing shame he had sometimes criticized her for being too emotional, for getting too involved with the people she was trying to help. The diary revealed that Diana had often come home from these charitable visits energized and full of ideas for how the royal family could do more to help. She had written detailed plans for new initiatives, ways to use their influence to bring attention to overlooked problems. But she also wrote about how those ideas were often dismissed or watered down by advisors who worried about political implications or breaking with tradition. "I proposed a series of visits to AIDS wards," one entry read. "The advisors were horrified. They said it was too controversial that the royal family couldn't be seen taking sides on such a divisive issue. But what side am I taking by showing compassion to dying people? How is holding someone's hand political? Sometimes I think they forget that behind all these titles and protocols, we're supposed to be serving real people with real problems." Charles set the diary down and walked to the window. Outside, the grounds of Highgrove stretched in the morning light, carefully tended and peaceful. He thought about all the times Diana had tried to share her passion for helping others, how he had seen her emotional involvement as a weakness rather than a strength. He had been shaped by centuries of royal tradition that emphasized duty over feeling, protocol over spontaneity. But Diana had understood something he was only now beginning to grasp. Returning to the diary, he found entries that showed Diana's growing frustration with the constraints of royal life. She wrote about feeling like she was performing a role, rather than living her life, always having to consider how her actions would be perceived rather than following her heart. "I want to take William and Harry to a regular playground," she had written. "It's not one that's been cleared of other children, not one where security officers lurk behind every tree. I want them to experience normal childhood, to make friends with. Children who don't care about titles or protocol, but every suggestion I make is met with security concerns or worry about the other children's safety. My boys are growing up in a bubble, and I'm terrified they'll never know what real life is." Charles thought about his own childhood, how isolated he had been from other children, how every experience had been filtered through the lens of royal protocol. Diana had been trying to give their son something he had never had, a sense of normalcy and connection to the world beyond palace walls. Instead of supporting her efforts, he had often sided with the security teams and advisors, thinking he was protecting his children, when perhaps he was actually limiting them. The morning sun climbed higher as Charles continued reading each page, offering new insights into the woman he was realizing he had never truly known. Diana's diary was showing him not just her thoughts and feelings, but also reflecting back to him his own failures as a husband and father. Yet somehow, instead of feeling defensive, he found himself feeling grateful for this unexpected gift of understanding. The third day of reading brought Charles to entries that covered some of the most difficult periods of their marriage. His coffee grew cold as he read Diana's account of the growing distance between them. Her attempts to understand what was happening to their relationship and her increasing sense of loneliness. Charles came home late again tonight, she had written. When I asked about his day, he gave me the same polite responses he gives to reporters. We're living like strangers who happen to share the same house. I watch other couples at public events, how they look at each other, how they seem to communicate without words. I wonder if Charles and I ever had that, or if I just imagined it during our brief courtship. Charles remembered those days when his schedule had become increasingly demanding. He had convinced himself that working harder, taking on more responsibilities, was the best way to serve the crown and provide for his family. Reading Diana's words, he realized how his dedication to duty had come at the cost of his dedication to his wife. The diary entries showed Diana's attempts to reach out to him. In various ways, she wrote about planning surprise visits to his office, hoping to steal a few minutes together. She described choosing her outfits carefully for public events, hoping he might notice and compliment her. She had even tried to engage with his interests. In environmental conservation, writing about books she had read on climate change and sustainable agriculture. I read Charles's speech about rainforest conservation 3 times, one entry revealed. I wanted to understand his passion for environmental issues, to be able to discuss them with him. When I brought it up at dinner, he seemed pleased for a moment, but then the phone rang with some urgent matter, and the moment was lost. I sometimes wonder if there will ever be a time when we can just be Charles and Diana, not the Prince and Princess of Wales. What struck Charles most painfully was how Diana had blamed herself for their growing problems. Entry after entry showed her analyzing her own behavior, wondering if she was too emotional, too demanding, not sophisticated enough for royal life. She wrote about feeling like she was constantly failing some tests she didn't understand, trying to measure up to expectations that were never clearly explained to her. Maybe I'm not cut out for this life, she had written during what Charles recognized as a particularly difficult period. The other royal women seemed to navigate these waters so effortlessly. They know exactly what to say, how to behave, when to speak, and when to remain silent. I feel like I'm constantly stumbling, saying the wrong thing, caring too much about the wrong people. Perhaps Charles would be happier with someone who better understands how to be a proper princess. Charles felt his throat tighten as he read these words. Diana had been trying so hard to fit into a world that had never been designed. For someone with her warmth and spontaneity, the royal system that he had grown up in, with its emphasis on emotional restraint and traditional protocols, had been crushing the very qualities that made Diana special. The diary revealed moments when Diana had reached out for help. To understand the complex web of royal expectations and relationships, she wrote about conversations with other members of the royal family, seeking guidance on how to better fulfill her role. But often, the advice she received seemed to center on suppressing her natural instincts rather than finding ways to channel them positively. Asked about visiting more hospitals and charities, she had written, I was told that I was already doing enough, that I shouldn't overwhelm my schedule with too many emotional commitments. But these visits don't drain me, they energize me. When I'm holding a sick child or talking to someone who's struggling, I feel like I'm finally doing something important. Why is that seen as a problem rather than a gift? Charles began to understand how the very system he had been raised in had failed Diana. The royal tradition of emotional distance and formal protocol had been designed for a different era, for people who had been groomed from birth to suppress their feelings and follow rigid rules. Diana had brought a new kind of royalty to the family, one based on genuine human connection and empathy. Instead of recognizing this as an asset, the institution had tried to reshape her into something she wasn't. As he continued reading, Charles found entries that showed Diana's growing awareness of her public impact. She wrote about the letters she received from people around the world, thanking her for bringing attention to causes they cared about or simply for making them feel seen and valued. These letters clearly meant everything to her, providing validation that her instincts about connecting with people were right. A woman wrote to me from Australia, Diana had noted. Her son died of AIDS, and she said that seeing me hold hands with AIDS patients on television helped her feel less alone in her grief. She said it showed her that her son's life had value, that he wasn't something to be ashamed of. How can something so simple as human touch have such power? Why don't more people understand this? Charles realized that Diana had been ahead of her time, pioneering a new kind of royal engagement that would later become the standard for modern monarchy. Her instincts about what people needed from their royal family had been absolutely correct. But at the time, her approach had been seen as radical and potentially dangerous to the institution. The diary also revealed Diana's growing confidence as a mother. She wrote extensively about William and Harry, describing their personalities, their interests, their struggles and triumphs. Her love for her sons radiated from every word, but so did her determination to raise them differently than royal children had been raised before. William asked me today why he can't play with the gardener's children, she had written. I tried to explain about security and protocol, but the words felt hollow. He's 7 years old. Doesn't understand why being a prince means being lonely. I don't want my boys to grow up thinking they're better than other people, just different. There has to be a way to prepare them for their roles while still letting them be children. Thought about his own childhood, how isolated and formal it had been. Diana had been trying to give William and Harry something he had never experienced. A childhood that balanced royal responsibility with normal human experiences. At the time, he had often worried that she was being too permissive, too casual. About royal protocol, now he saw that she had been trying to raise princes who would be able to connect with the people they would one day serve. The entries also showed Diana's struggles with the intense media attention that followed her everywhere. She wrote about the difficulty of never being able to have a private moment, of always being watched and judged. But what surprised Charles was how often she expressed concern, not for herself, but for how the media attention affected others around. Her photographers followed me to the school today, she had written. The children were so excited to see the cameras, they couldn't focus on learning. I felt terrible that my presence had disrupted their day. Sometimes I wonder if I do more harm than good, if my desire to help actually makes things harder for the people I'm trying to serve. As the afternoon wore on, Charles found himself developing a completely new understanding of the woman he had been married to for 15 years. Diana's diary was revealing not just her thoughts and feelings, but also her remarkable insight into human nature and her deep commitment to making the world a better place. She had been so much more than he had ever realized, and he had been too blind to see it. Charles had reached the entries from the most turbulent period of their marriage, and his hands shook as he turned each page. These were the years when their relationship had begun to crumble publicly, when every newspaper seemed to carry stories about their problems. But Diana's private words told a very different story than the one the media had constructed. The newspapers are calling me difficult again, she had written. They say I'm too demanding, too emotional, that I don't understand my place. But what they don't see are the nights I spend lying awake, wondering how to save my marriage. They don't know is that I would give anything to have Charles look at me the way he used to. Back when we were first engaged and everything seemed possible, Charles remembered reading those newspaper articles, feeling frustrated and defensive. At the time, he had often felt that Diana was being unfair to him, that she didn't understand the pressures he was under. But her diary revealed a woman who was fighting desperately to hold their family together. Even as she felt everything slipping away, the entries showed Diana's attempts to seek counseling and guidance during this difficult period. She wrote about sessions with therapists, trying to understand her own behavior and find ways to improve their relationship. What struck Charles was how often she focused on her own shortcomings rather than his, always looking for ways she could change rather than expecting him to adapt. Dr. Morrison asked me today what I need from Charles, she had written after one therapy session. The question caught me off guard. I've spent so long trying to figure out what he needs from me that I'd forgotten I'm allowed to have needs too. When I finally answered, it sounded so simple. I need him to see me. Not the Princess of Wales, not the mother of his children, not the woman in the photographs. Just me, Diana. I need him to be curious about who I am when no one else is watching. Charles set the diary down and walked to the window again. How had he missed something so fundamental? Diana hadn't been asking for grand gestures or dramatic changes. She had simply wanted to be known by her own husband, to feel like he was interested in her as a person. Instead, he had been so focused on their public roles and royal duties that he had forgotten to nurture the private relationship that was supposed to be at the heart of their marriage. Returning to the diary, he found entries that revealed Diana's growing involvement with charitable causes was partly motivated by her need to find meaning and purpose outside of their struggling marriage. She wrote about how working with people in need made her feel valuable and useful in ways that royal ceremonies and state dinners never could. "I spent the morning at a shelter for homeless women," she had written. "One woman, Sarah, told me about losing her job and then her apartment, how quickly everything fell apart. She said that talking to me made her feel human again, like she mattered. I understand that feeling so well. Sometimes I think the women I'm trying to help are actually helping me more than I'm helping them." Charles began to see how Diana's charitable work had become a lifeline for her during their marriage difficulties. While he had sometimes viewed her emotional involvement with various causes as excessive or inappropriate, it had actually been essential to her sense of self-worth. In helping others, she had found the validation and purpose that she wasn't getting at home. The diary entries also revealed Diana's deep concern for William and Harry. During this troubled time, she wrote extensively about trying to shield them from the tensions between their parents, working hard to maintain a sense of normalcy and security for them, even as her own world was falling apart. "William asked me today why Daddy doesn't live with us anymore," she had written during a period when Charles had been staying elsewhere more frequently. Didn't know how to explain that sometimes adults need space to figure things out, that it doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. But looking at his confused little face, I wondered if that was even true. Maybe someone did do something wrong. Maybe I did. The pain in Diana's words was almost unbearable to read. Charles realized that she had been carrying enormous guilt about their marriage problems, blaming herself for not being able to make their relationship work. She had been trying to be both mother and father to their sons during his frequent absences, all while dealing with her own emotional turmoil. But what surprised Charles most were the entries that showed Diana still fighting for their marriage, even when things seemed hopeless. She wrote about ideas for vacations they could take together, ways they might reconnect as a couple. She described watching him from across rooms at public events, looking for signs that he might still care about her as more than just a co-parent. "And royal partner?" "Charles smiled at something I said today at the charity luncheon," she had written. "It was the first real smile he'd given me in weeks. Not one of those polite public smiles, but a genuine one. For just a moment, I saw the man I fell in love with, the one who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt. I wonder if that man is still in there somewhere, buried under all the duty and disappointment." Charles felt tears streaming down his face as he read these words. That man was still there, had always been there, but he had been so wrapped up in his responsibilities and his own hurt feelings that he had forgotten how to show it. Diana had been looking for signs of love and connection right up until the end, even when he thought she had given up on them completely. The diary revealed that Diana had been much more aware of his needs and struggles than he had realized. She wrote about the pressure he was under from his mother, from Parliament, from the public. She described watching him during difficult meetings and official functions, seeing the strain on his face even when he was trying to hide it from everyone else. "Charles looked exhausted after the meeting with the Prime Minister today," she had noted. "I wanted to ask him about it, to let him know that I understand the weight he carries. But we've grown so distant that I don't know how to reach out anymore. I'm afraid that if I try to comfort him, he'll see it as intrusion rather than support. When do we become strangers to each other?" Charles realized that Diana had been trying to support him in ways he had never recognized. Her attempts at conversation, her interest in his work, her efforts to create peaceful moments at home had all been motivated by love and concern for him. But he had been so defensive, so focused on protecting himself from what he perceived as criticism, that he had missed her genuine care for his well-being. As the sun began to set on his 4th day of reading, Charles came to entries that dealt with their decision to separate. Diana's words revealed the agony of that choice, her fear about what it would mean for William and Harry, and her deep sadness about the failure of their marriage. "We're going to announce the separation next week," she had written. Charles and I finally had an honest conversation today, the first one in months. We both agreed that we can't continue as we have been, that we're making each other miserable and probably confusing the boys. But sitting there, discussing the end of our marriage, like a business arrangement, all I could think about was our wedding day. I was so young, so hopeful. I really believed we would be happy together. The entry continued with Diana's reflections on their relationship and her hopes for the future. Despite everything they had been through, her words showed no bitterness or anger, only sadness and a desire to find a way forward that would be best for everyone involved, especially their children. The entries following their separation revealed a Diana that Charles had never known existed, away from the pressures of their marriage and the constant scrutiny of living together under the royal microscope. She had begun to discover who she truly was as an individual. Her writing became more confident, more self-assured, though tinged with the sadness of their failed relationship. "I'm learning to be alone," she had written a few months after their separation. "It's strange how quiet the apartment gets in the evenings. No meetings in the next room, no phone calls about state business. It's just me and my thoughts.
Date?
It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. I'm starting to remember who Diana Spencer was before she became the Princess of Wales." Charles found these entries particularly painful to read because they showed him what Diana might have become if their marriage had succeeded. If he had been able to nurture her growth rather than inadvertently stifling it, her writing revealed a woman of remarkable intelligence and insight. Someone who was thinking deeply about her role in the world and how she could use her position to make a real difference. The diary showed Diana throwing herself into her charitable work with renewed energy and focus. She wrote about visiting landmine victims in Angola, describing the horror of seeing children who had lost limbs to weapons left behind after conflicts had ended. Her words revealed both her emotional response to the suffering she witnessed and her growing understanding of the political complexities surrounding humanitarian issues. The little girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She had written after one particularly difficult visit. She stepped on a landmine while walking to school. Her leg was gone, but her eyes were so bright, so full of life. She told me through the translator that she wants to be a teacher someday. I held her hand and promised her that people around the world would hear her story. But sitting there, I realized that my promise meant I had to be braver than I've ever been before. Charles recognized this as the period when Diana had begun to speak out more forcefully about causes she believed in, sometimes against the advice of royal advisors who worried about political implications. At the time, he had been concerned about her increasingly independent stance, worried that she was stepping outside the traditional bounds of royal protocol. Now he understood that she had been finding her voice, becoming the advocate she was meant to be. The diary entries revealed Diana's evolving relationship with the media during this period. She wrote about learning to use publicity strategically, understanding that the intense interest in her personal life could be channeled to bring attention to important causes. Her writing showed a sophisticated understanding of how fame and influence could be leveraged for good. "The photographers will follow me anywhere I go," she had noted. "If I'm going to be in the newspapers anyway, I might as well make sure it's for something that matters." When I hugged that AIDS patient last week, the photo was on front pages around the world. Maybe some people saw that image and realized that HIV doesn't make someone untouchable. Maybe some parents looked at their own children differently. If my fame can chip away at ignorance and fear, then perhaps there's a purpose to all of this attention. Charles was struck by Diana's growing political awareness and her willingness to take on controversial subjects. She wrote about educating herself on complex international issues, reading policy papers and meeting with experts to understand the broader context of the problems she was trying to address. This was a side of Diana he had rarely seen during their marriage, when she had often seemed to rely on instinct and emotion rather than detailed analysis. "I spent 3 hours with Dr. Williams today, learning about the arms trade and how landmines are manufactured and distributed," she had written. "The statistics are staggering. Millions of these weapons are buried in countries around the world, waiting to maim innocent people decades after conflicts have ended. The people who make money from selling these weapons will try to discredit anyone who speaks out against them. I know that taking on this cause will make me enemies, But how can I stay silent when children are dying? The diary showed Diana's increasing confidence in her own judgment and her willingness to act independently of royal advisors and protocol. She wrote about making decisions based on her own moral compass rather than political considerations. It's understanding that this approach sometimes put her at odds with the establishment, but feeling compelled to follow her conscience. During this period, the entries also revealed Diana's evolving relationship with William and Harry. She wrote about trying to balance her desire to protect them from the chaos of their parents' separation with her determination to prepare them for the realities of life outside palace walls. Her approach to mothering became more intentional and philosophical. I took the boys to visit a homeless shelter today, she had written. William was quiet afterward, asking lots of questions about why some people don't have homes. Harry wanted to give away his toys to the children we met. I know some people think I'm exposing them to too much sadness too young, but I want them to understand that being privileged comes with responsibilities. They need to see beyond the palace walls if they're going to serve people effectively someday. Charles realized that Diana had been preparing their sons for royal life in a way that was completely different from his own upbringing. Where he had been sheltered from the harder realities of life until he was older, Diana was showing William and Harry the full spectrum of human experience, helping them develop empathy and understanding that would serve them well in their future roles. The diary entries also revealed Diana's thoughts about her relationship with Charles during their separation. Contrary to what the media had suggested, her writing showed no anger or resentment toward him. Instead, she expressed sadness about their inability to connect and genuine concern for his well-being. Saw Charles at Harry's school play today. She had written, he looked tired, older somehow. I wanted to ask him how he's doing, but we barely spoke beyond the pleasant. The final entries in Diana's diary covered the last months of her life. Charles approached them with a mixture of anticipation and dread. These pages held her most mature reflections, her final thoughts about their relationship, their children, and her hopes for the future that would never come to pass. I had lunch with William today. She had written just weeks before her death. He's becoming such a thoughtful young man, so aware of the world around him. He talked about his future role, about the kind of king he wants to be someday. He said he wants to be accessible to people, to understand their problems and help solve them. I told him that leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about caring enough to keep looking for them. I think he understood. Charles felt a surge of pride reading about his eldest son, mixed with regret that he hadn't been part of more conversations like this. Diana had been preparing William for kingship in ways that went far beyond protocol and constitutional law. She had been teaching him about empathy, about the human heart of leadership. The diary revealed that Diana had been thinking deeply about her legacy during those final months. She wrote about wanting to be remembered not for her title or her fame, but for the difference she had made in individual lives. Her entries showed a woman who had found peace with her choices and was focused on the future rather than dwelling on past disappointments. A mother wrote to me from Scotland, Diana had noted in one of her last entries. Her daughter was born with severe disabilities, and she said that seeing me interact naturally with disabled children in photographs had given her hope that her daughter could live a full life. She said I had shown her that different doesn't mean less valuable. If that's the only thing I'm remembered for, it would be enough. Charles realized that Diana had achieved something he had always struggled with, finding a way to balance personal authenticity with public service. She had managed to be genuinely herself while still fulfilling her royal duties, creating a new model of what it meant to serve the crown in the modern world. The final entries also revealed Diana's thoughts about Charles himself. Far from the bitterness or anger he might have expected, her words showed a remarkable level of forgiveness and understanding. She wrote about seeing him at various public events, about her hopes that he could find happiness in his own life. Charles spoke beautifully at the environmental conference yesterday, she had written. I watched him from the back of the room, and I could see how passionate he is about these issues, how much he cares about leaving a better world for future generations. I wish I had been able to support that passion better when we were together. Maybe if I had understood then what I understand now about the importance of having a purpose bigger than yourself, we might have found common ground. These words hit Charles like a physical blow. Even at the end, Diana had been taking responsibility for their failed marriage, looking for ways she could have done better, rather than focusing on his shortcomings. Her generosity of spirit was humbling, especially knowing how little he had appreciated it while she was alive. Diana's final entries also revealed her excitement about her evolving relationship with her sons as they grew older. She wrote about Harry's sense of humor and his rebellious streak, about how she was trying to channel his energy in positive directions. She described William's growing seriousness about his future responsibilities and her efforts to help him maintain his humanity despite the weight of his destiny. Harry made me laugh until I cried today, she had written just days before her final trip to Paris. He was imitating the Archbishop's sermon from last Sunday, capturing every gesture and inflection perfectly. He has such a gift for seeing the absurdity in formal situations. I hope he never loses that ability to find joy in humor, even when life gets serious. The world needs people who can make others smile. Charles smiled through his tears as he read this, remembering Harry's mischievous nature as a child. Diana had understood that their younger son's irreverence wasn't disrespectful, but rather a valuable quality that would help him connect with people and maintain perspective throughout his life. The diary's final entries showed Diana looking toward the future with optimism. She wrote about new charitable projects she wanted to undertake, about her hopes for William and Harry's continued growth, about her belief that the royal family could evolve and remain relevant in the changing world. I feel like I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be, she had written in what would be one of her last entries.
Oh.
It took me a long time to understand that strength doesn't come from never falling down.
Oh.
It comes from getting back up each time you do. I've made mistakes. We all have. But I've learned from them. I know who I am now, what I stand for, what legacy I want to leave for my boys. The final entry in the diary was dated just 3 days before Diana's death. Charles's hands trembled as he read her last written words, not knowing they would be her last. I'm going to Paris tomorrow, she had written. I know there will be photographers everywhere, speculation about my personal life, all the usual circus.
Oh.
But I've learned not to let that control my choices. I'm going because I want to, because life is short and uncertain, and we have to grab moments of happiness when they come. I hope William and Harry understand someday that everything I've done, every choice I've made since they were born, has been motivated by love for them. They are my greatest achievement, my most important legacy. The woman revealed in these pages was someone he had never fully known, someone of remarkable depth, wisdom, and grace. Diana had been so much more than he had ever understood, and he had been too blind, too caught up in his own struggles and expectations, to see her clearly. For the first time since Diana's death, Charles allowed himself to truly grieve, not just for the mother of his children, but for the extraordinary woman he had lost without ever really knowing. The diary had shown him a love story, but not the one he had expected. It was the story of Diana's love for their sons, for the people she served, for life itself. Perhaps most remarkably, despite everything they had been through, it was the story of her enduring love for him, expressed not in romantic terms, but in forgiveness, understanding, and hope for his happiness. As Charles sat alone in his study, Diana's diary closed before him. He felt something shift inside his heart. The guilt and regret he had carried for years began to transform into something else, something that felt like gratitude. Diana had given him one final gift through her words, the gift of understanding, of seeing their story through her eyes, of knowing that love could survive even when marriage could not. Charles fell to his knees beside his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. Diana's diary had revealed not just who she was, but who they both could have been if they had found a way to truly see and understand each other. It was too late to change their story, but perhaps it wasn't too late to honor her memory by becoming the man her words had shown him he could be, no father she had hoped he would become for William and Harry. V.